Dr. Ralph Wood presents Tolkien's Vision of Wonder in a Time of Terror at the 2017 Newman Institute.
I am astonished at this turnout. Some of my friends say, you're the only person in the world that gets greater applause when he stands up than when he sits down. But there are chairs here for you against the back wall. So please, there are 4 here, 2 here, 4 there. So before we get started, please come and take them. And let me therefore spend just a couple of sentences saying that my visit here has been utterly delightful. John and Helen Free have been wonderful hosts, along with their 3 wonderful children, whom I call the Wee Frees. And then to meet the bishop, to meet the brothers here, is to say that though in my career I've lectured on a number of state university campuses with Newman centers, I've not seen one anywhere that compares to the one here in Lincoln, Nebraska. It's simply astonishing. And it's not only because of this gorgeous building, 2015, but it's the quality of the witness. It's the faithfulness of the witness. I see young people here being formed in profound ways that will make them future shapers of the church. And so it's with great gratitude that I've come here tonight to speak on Tolkien and his vision of wonder in a time of terror. I thought it might be good to begin, however, with a bit of overview of Tolkien's life. Some of you would know it well, others might not know it so well. So let me talk for a few minutes about Tolkien the person. Tolkien is born in 1892 in South Africa, where his father had gone to seek his fortune, as many Brits did in the late 19th century. Then when Mrs. Tolkien became pregnant with their second child, she came back to England, fearing that having a child there under less than ideal medical circumstances could endanger both her and the child. So she comes back to England to have Hilary, Tolkien's brother. Alas, while she's back in England, giving birth to Hilary, Tolkien's father dies. So it's important to note that Tolkien grows up without his father, and with a bare remembrance at age 3 what his father even looked like. And that, of course, was to be determinative for the whole of Tolkien's life. He therefore is reared by his mother, who does a very drastic thing soon after Hilary is born, and that is she becomes a Roman Catholic. Now, some of you are old enough to know that until very recently, the single most vicious anti-Catholic nation in the world was England. Because of the Guy Fawkes tradition, I was saying to my friends, it's hard to believe there were riots in the streets of London when the Catholic Church restored the hierarchy and brought a bishop back. We could not have these Catholics having any place of prominence in England. But here's the crux. Mrs. Tolkien was a typical C of E Christian, Church of England, and she saw that this was like being background noise. It was a faith, in her case, that made no difference. It was the paint on the wall. She wanted to have a faith that was angular, that stood at a sharp, acute angle in relation to culture, that cut, that made a difference. And she saw very quickly that was Rome. And so she converted to Rome, and she moved to Birmingham because she had become, in those years, a great advocate of Cardinal Newman. Some of you know he established his first oratory in Birmingham, and she wanted her boys to grow up as altar boys in the church in Birmingham, so she moved there. And to support those 2 sons, she worked herself so hard that she in turn died early. I want you to think long and hard about what Tolkien said. He said, my mother, working herself to death, I think she may have had TB, someone may remember the actual disease. My mother was a martyr for the faith. She died that Hillary and I be given a Catholic upbringing. And so they were taken in by a local priest named Father Francis Xavier Morgan. You can't get much more Catholic than that. And he brought them into the life of the church where they were choir boys. And let's look at some pictures of them in their early years. Can you see in the very back? I hope you can. Notice the solemn look upon their faces. These are two young boys who've already been scarred by life. They know the meaning of suffering. And that will be one of the main themes of Tolkien's life. The local school there in Birmingham, run by the Oratory, was good but not great. And Father Morgan saw that he had on his hands two brilliant youths. And therefore, to keep them in the Catholic school of Birmingham was to cripple their education. And so he put them in King Edward's School. Let's just look at some of the pictures here. Sorry. How do I go backward? Sorry, can I go backward?
The middle button.
The middle button. There we are. Here Tolkien is at the school of King Edward, and he was a tough rugby player. Can you spot him from having seen the first image? Right there. You've all seen the bumper stickers that says, "Give blood, play rugby." So he was a tough rugger, as they call it, but he was also a very serious student of languages. For example, this is the main hall of King Edward's School. You can see it's a beautiful Victorian building, studying at those classic Victorian kinds of desks. Tolkien came back for an old boys reunion of former students at King Edward's who had died in World War I. And all of a sudden, those images began to flood back on Tolkien, especially his memory of the Battle of the Somme, one of the most horrific battles of World War I, where when you came out of your trench and came over the top, as they say, you were walking on the faces of your dead comrades, most of whom were frozen in ice and mud. And that led to the scene called the Passage of the Dead Marshes. I would wager some of the young people in the front row know that passage, a horrific passage where they're doing exactly that. Notice one of his closest friends was G.B. Smith. They performed Aristophanes of the Frogs in Greek in high school. Tolkien could speak both Greek and Latin in high school. So as a kind of lark, his graduating class from King Edward's sang the British national anthem, God Save the King, in Greek. So that must be the aspiration of folks at the Newman Institute here to sing the Nebraska anthem in Greek. While Tolkien is a student there, age 18, he meets and falls in love with this beautiful woman with a very unfortunate name, Edith Bratz. They were chaste lovers, C-H-A-S-T-E, and they spoke therefore of the three great kisses. Imagine what word would be substituted in our culture. Father Morgan saw that if he allowed his charge young John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, Tollers for short. He would marry early. He'd be lost to the world of scholarship and learning. So he forbade them to have any contact whatsoever of any kind until Tolkien reached his age of majority, i.e. 21. She would then be 24. And Father Morgan assumed they would both have forgotten each other. It would be over and Tolkien will go up to Oxford. He'll be a shining star at Oxford and Edith Bratz will be forgotten. Friends, it doesn't work that way. At midnight, on the night he turned 21, Tolkien wrote a letter to Edith Bratz saying, I've never forgotten you. You are the love of my life. I want to come and see you and for us to be reunited. In the meantime, she had been engaged to another man. She broke that engagement. She and Tolkien were then very happily married and remained married, of course, until their deaths. She was such a gifted pianist that she could have been a concert pianist. So we don't want to paint our heroes in gold. They all have flaws. They have feet of clay. And she honestly resented the way in which she was unable to pursue her own professional career as a pianist in order to raise their 4 children. Not that that was beneath her, but Tolkien was off becoming the greatest philologist, student of languages, of his time, while she was at home raising the kids. So in a kind of rebellion against that, she never sponsored what the British call at-homes, that is to say, tea parties in the Tolkien household. And so she became known as the wife of an Oxford professor who did not call. And call does not mean ring up on the phone, it means to make a visit. So she lived a bit of a solitary and, at least in the early years, unhappy life. Here Tolkien is at 19. He has 2 more years yet before he can be reunited with Edith and be married. On their honeymoon, Tolkien begins writing his great retelling of the cosmic story that he would call his Legendarium, where he would put in mythic form the whole cosmic universal story, but cast, as we heard Dr. Freese say, in fresh terms that would bring alive that story, but for the English tradition. He did not like the fact that the Arthurian legends are all French. To be honest, I hope there are no French majors here. He did not like the frogs. He said, now remember, French does have 5 vowels, ah. And so he began on the honeymoon to write this huge, lifelong work, which until just this week I learned from Helen, Christopher, his son, has finally turned over the Tolkien estate to other hands, as Christopher was to take up the Tolkien tradition after his father died in 1973 until this week, reshaping and publishing his father's previously unpublished work. 12 volumes, called The History of the Peoples of Middle-earth. Because Tolkien wrote draft after draft after draft, sitting in the middle of his bed, cross-legged, with all of his notes spread around him, and using what I call the biblical method of typing, seek and ye shall find, two-fingered, not an electric, but an old-fashioned typewriter, draft after draft, but throwing none of them away. Tolkien could never finish anything. People have to take manuscripts away from him to get them published. And so he begins that at the age of 21. Oh, sorry. Tolkien was the youngest person ever to have been given a full chair of English at Oxford when he achieved that accomplishment at age 29. Now remember, at Oxford, there's only one chair per department. Everybody else is either a fellow or a tutor. And you work your way up through the ranks, and maybe by the time you're 50, you'll be given a chair. C.S. Lewis, his dear friend, never was given a chair of English literature at Oxford. Though Tolkien thought Lewis was the most brilliant person at Oxford, and he was penalized because he was what I call an out Christian. He was one who was unabashed about his Christian faith, and already in the 40s and 50s, that was being held against him. At the end of his life, Tolkien maneuvered, however, Lewis into be given a chair of Renaissance and medieval literature at Cambridge. You know, that's like being given one over at the University of Missouri when Nebraska has refused one. He has his career at Merton College. How many of you have been to Oxford? It really is a mystical place. You really need to go. Merton College, where he worked there until his retirement. That's the Tom Quad for Christ Church College in the background. These are a series of pictures of Tolkien the man. I'll tell you a bit about his daughter in a minute. Priscilla said to me, "My father was constitutionally incapable of making a bad picture." And sure enough, look how attractive he is. Here he is with his dear friend C.S. Lewis. These have been, of course, shoved together. That's not a single photo. I learned from reading a recent biography of Lewis that there are 25 extant photographs of C.S. Lewis. Can you believe that? Only 25, where there are hundreds of Tolkien. For all kinds of reasons, Lewis was never in front of a camera. This is the home where Tolkien, as I say, on North Broadmoor, and his family lived from 26 to 47. And that was the years, of course, of his children's growing up. And do you all recognize the blue medallion in the upper center? If you've been to Britain, every historical home where someone of fame lived is marked by one of these. You can see it's a quite roomy house. He moved out of that house closer into central Oxford after he had published Lord of the Rings. He couldn't believe it that he'd be sitting in the living room and there would be ugly Americans coming and looking in their front window with their cameras, making pictures of them. Rude, bumptious, ignorant, ugly Americans. Here's his daughter, Priscilla, in 2013, which means she's now 84. I'm still in communication with her. Unfortunately, she doesn't do email, and writing for her is somewhat difficult, but we do correspond. And so when I had a leave at the University of London, King's College, in 1988, I had heard that she sometimes will entertain visitors from America. So I wrote her a note and asked, would you consider my coming out and talking to you just an hour there in your home in Somerton, which is a North Oxford suburb. I said, sure, come on. I said, I promise you I'll stay only an hour. I'll arrive at 3 o'clock. I got there at 3. 2.5 hours later, she said, excuse me, please. She went back into her kitchen and brought out tea. You all know what tea is in the English tradition? That does not mean a cup of Lipton. It means an early supper. Cucumber sandwiches, laced with strawberries covered in what they call full fat cream. You know, the British don't like, our polite terms. We cover over the truth. And these, for example, they've called people like me OAP, old age pensioner. And then these wonderful thick scones. Scones are like really good, as we say in East Texas, heavy biscuits that are sweet. So scones and strawberries and full-fat cream and tea and cucumber sandwiches. Turns out she loves the American South. She's a great fan of Walker Percy and Flannery O'Connor, two of my heroes. So how could I stop talking to her with things like that? But several things interesting came up. I said to her, what was it like to grow up in the home of a celebrity? She said, I didn't know he was a celebrity. That he was just upstairs pecking away, just my daddy. But she said, my father was concerned that I would have the same kind of education that my brothers had. She had 3 brothers. And therefore, I, as a woman, would not suffer in any way a second-rate education. And so she became, of her own accord, a social worker. She said, my father was not a Democrat, not a Republican by our standards. He was a Tory. He wanted a king to be restored to England, and therefore voted to the right of the right of the right of the right, but said he cared more about the little people at Oxford than all of the liberals put together. And they loved him because he did not condescend to them. But then the low moment came when she said, you know, my father would have no use for you. And I began, she said, because you're a Baptist. So I began to back and fill, and she said, you need to know, when we returned to Oxford, my mother got no help whatsoever from the Baptist Tolkiens. On one side, there were Unitarians, on the other side, Baptists. She had to rear us by herself. Some help from the Suffields, which were the maternal line. But then she said, you know, this is the marvelous thing about my father. When he sat down to write an epic fantasy like The Lord of the Rings, all of that bigotry fell away. He hated Vatican II. He hated the destruction of the Latin language and Roman worship. He said all of that fell away, and he rose to the level of what C.S. Lewis calls mere, essential, bedrock, non-negotiable Christian faith. And of course, that's what imbues his work, as we shall see in just a minute. That means for Tolkien, this is a very important distinction, he did not want his work to be overtly Christian, as of course his dear friend C.S. Lewis's is. If you haven't figured out that Aslan is the Jesus, the Savior of Narnia, you might want to have an IQ test. There is no Christ in The Lord of the Rings. Gandalf has Christ-like qualities. He dies. He comes back to life. But he doesn't die for anyone's sins. He salvages only the company of 9 walkers. And of course, he will have to die again. He is resuscitated from death to life. So while there have been hundreds, thousands, Lazarus, for example, brought back to life from death, resuscitated, only to die again, there's been only one resurrection. And so that kind of Christian vision in Tolkien is nowhere made overt. Frodo has Christ-like qualities. His bearing of the one all-powerful, oppressive ring is not unlike our Lord's bearing of the cross. Sam carries Frodo up Mount Doom. He is a literal Christopher, one who bears Christ. But there is no Christ as such. Here was Tolkien's very important saying. He said, if my fiction has to stand on Christian Catholic props, somebody should knock them out from under it. I want my fiction to be self-vindicating as a work of art. It must stand on its own excellence or fall. And of course, that's not true of Lewis. Lewis is an evangelist for the faith. Tolkien, as a Roman Catholic, felt the church is the evangelist for the faith. Art is not a tool for evangelism. So I was lecturing one time and someone said, how many people have been led to the Lord by Tolkien? That's a good Protestant question, by the way. I said, nobody as far as I know. And that wouldn't have bothered Tolkien a whit. What Tolkien does is open us up to the possibility of belief through his vision of wonder, and above all, his vision of horror and terror. So all of the Christianity in Tolkien is silently, subtly Catholic, because he had become the great scholar of Beowulf. People were confused about what to make of Beowulf. It's clearly a pagan poem. It's about these Danes who, fight unto death, and they'll slaughter each other and just live a brutal life. But there are these Christian kind of twinklings, kind of shards of light flying through. And Tolkien said, here's what happened. It was Christian monks who thought Danish culture was worth preserving and not simply triumphing over and squashing. And so what they did was preserve those great Danish heroic stories, but with hints of Christianity. So let me give you a couple of hints about the Catholicism present in Tolkien. The most obvious is Lady Galadriel. He said, I could not have conceived of Galadriel without my devotion to the Blessed Virgin. Limbas, can you believe that some of our Protestant students missed that? Is so clearly Eucharistic bread. It doesn't fill the stomach. It strengthens the will. Exactly what the Eucharistic bread does. Notice Gollum can't stand it. It's the antithesis to Gollum. Therefore, I'll say only one negative thing about Peter Jackson. He screwed it all up in the second by having Gollum use Limbas to trick Frodo into thinking Sam had forsaken him. I saw that movie with Helen Lassiter. We almost walked out. Third, this is one of the few discoveries of my own. When Boromir dies, remember Boromir is the one who breaks the company, who says, let me have the ring. I will best Sauron. We've never had a man willing and strong enough and courageous enough to be given this ring and therefore defeat Sauron. Of course, defying the central teaching of the book, the moment you have Sauron's power, you become Sauron. And so he breaks the company. Note well, my friends, the company is not broken from the outside by terrible secular humanists. It's broken from within the company. And so I ask my students, if there is a parallel to Boromir, whom might it be in the Christian world? Hands fly up in the air, Judas. No, Peter betrays his Lord. And of course, he, later, horrified by what he does, is found dying by Aragorn, who administers the last rites to him. Because Boromir says, I betrayed the ring. Confessio oris. Confession of the mouth. And I am so sorry. Of course, that is contritio cordis, sorrow of the heart. But he said, I killed all of the orcs I could, that Sam and Frodo might go free. Satisfactio operis, satisfaction by rightful penitential deeds. But you see how slyly Tolkien imbues the book with those Christian concerns. So I'm still in contact with Priscilla, and I hope to see her in June when I'm in Oxford. A student of mine has been confirmed into the Catholic Church in her parish with Walter Hooper as his sponsor. Walter Hooper is the literary executor of C.S. Lewis's estate. Wonderful small world. How many of you have lifted a glass here? Wonderful. The eagle and child, and of course the British make everything into a nickname. Bird and baby, they call it. They did not have their meetings of the Inklings there. They met in Lewis's room, but they met during the day at the Eagle and Child. And now you can see the little corner where they sat, smoking their pipes and quaffing their beer. Tolkien was doing the thing that every professor hates most of all, grading exams. And the British have this unbelievable system of cross-grading. You can't just pass at Oxford unless someone at Cambridge grades the essays that were set at Oxford. And the same thing is true of Edinburgh and St. Andrews. And you're paid for it. And Tolkien had a family of 5. And the British academics make nothing, friends. When I was there the last time, the average British academic makes about $25,000 or $30,000 a year. And so he was starving to death, and he was grading these papers, and the blue books, you all have the blue books at Nebraska, he comes to a blank page, what every professor hopes for. One page he will not have to plow through. And listen to my language, it's in the passive voice. He found himself saying, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Having no idea where that sentence came from, because for Tolkien, language is revelatory. Language is our unique gift. What makes us made in God's image, Tolkien believes, is the quality of speech and the quality of story. He says they come into the world at the same time. The Apostles' Creed is a compressed narrative of 3 acts. So he finds himself saying, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with ends of worms and oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. So he says, what's a hobbit? What's a hobbit? What's a hobbit? You remember the Anglo-Saxon word holbitla, Holbytla, which means hole dweller. And so he said, I will write my kids, they were now in their 20s, a Christmas story about this little creature I discovered and his friends. Tolkien believed that we should give gifts to our children that are from our own making. So stay away from the late sales going on. It began this year before Thanksgiving. Make something for your children. So he made this book called The Hobbit and gave it to his children. And they began to circulate it there in Oxford. And the word got around, this is really an interesting book. And so the word came to Rayner Unwin, a very important London publisher, that this book is making the rounds in Oxford, that people are finding a really interesting children's book. So he gets on the train, comes up to Oxford, and goes into Tolkien's house and says, everybody's talking about this book you've written. May I see it? And here will be the test. If my 13-year-old son likes it, we'll publish it. His 13-year-old son liked it. It was published in 1939, became an immediate bestseller. Rayner Unwin hits the train back to Oxford and says, we've got to have more of this. Tolkien says, no problem, I've got it. He goes upstairs and brings down a stack of the Legendarium, and Unwin says, oh my God, this is like reading the dictionary in Elvish. It's sheer, boring, dull, chronicle, fact, date, lineage. We want more hobbits. So in 1939, Tolkien set himself the task of trying to bring these strange creatures into his grand legendarium. And the result is 16 years later, the first volume of The Lord of the Rings is published. Tolkien assumed it would never come to fruition. As you know, London was under the Blitz in those days. Had we not entered the war in 41, England would have been overrun by the Germans more than likely. They had already bombed Coventry because it had a big automobile making plant. The assumption was the Germans would bomb Oxford. It also has a big automobile manufacturing plant. He said, it will go up in flames. I quit. Lewis said, you are not quitting. You have a masterpiece on your hands, and I'm going to hold you to it. And he did. He did. Would not let Tolkien quit. And so we owe this great debt to C.S. Lewis, who wouldn't let Tolkien give up his project. Tolkien was himself an illustrator of his own work, and pretty good, pretty good. This is his drawing of Bilbo coming to the huts of the Raft Elves and the Hobbit. And you see they're floating. Can you see this? That's Bilbo on the barrels. They're all riding barrels full of good brew, by the way. This is his drawing of Rivendell. And of course, Rivendell means literally a cloven ribbon valley or dell. And that's exactly what you get here. And there are whole books of Tolkien's illustrations. This is Edith Tolkien in her latter years. You can see she held her beauty to the end. Isn't she a lovely lady? Here they are in Tolkien's study. I think that's a translation into Chinese of his book. This is the last photograph made of Tolkien in 1973, the year of his death, standing beside his favorite tree in the botanical gardens at Oxford. Tolkien was in love with trees. He loved to just go out and sit with trees. He felt that trees are the largest analog of the human condition because they're so slow growing. Most things grow very quickly, but look at us. You know, I had a cat who was at 6 weeks a kitten. At 6 months, it was a cat. Trees take long, slow growth. And therefore, to slay a tree needlessly is, for John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, murder. I just taught Hopkins' poem, Benzie Poplars. If you don't know that poem, get thee to the bookstore and read Benzie Poplars. It's about slaying of such trees. And he was a terrible walker, however, with Lewis, because you remember the Brits are all walkers, and Lewis, the rainier and muddier it was, the better. They always had books in their hands. But Lewis's aim was to make progress. And every tree Tolkien came to, he'd want to begin to inspect it, look, see what it was. And of course, Lewis was passing on, so they stopped trying to have these mutual walks after a while. Anyone want to guess what the most noble animal? If trees are the noblest botanical creature, what is the most, for Tolkien, magnificent hen? Yes, sir. Eagle. Sorry, close. And because of the rescue of the eagles. Any other guess? Yes, ma'am. Oliphants? No. The horse. I mean, the horse subjects itself to human mastery when there are many other animals that don't. Zebras cannot be broken. Isn't that strange? You cannot break a zebra into human riding. And for Tolkien, there's a kind of mystical exchange that a horse will allow itself to be ridden and controlled. And of course, look at his wonderful name, Shadowfax. And Tolkien is a Latinist. He means he makes shadows. He moves so fast. And so Tolkien was in love with horses and trees. And when he saw what the motor cars, they call it, was doing to rural England, he sold his car and never drove again. They were destroying the beauty of rural England. It comes to this as it comes to all of us. This is the tomb of Edith Mary Tolkien. And last week, Helen Lassiter led her husband's class in a study of the Luthien Baron story, wonderful love story, clearly about Tolkien and Edith. And so his children insisted on writing her name, Luthien, 1888, 1971. And then you've got John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Can you see it? Baron, 1892, 1973. May I stop just for a minute to entertain questions before I go forward about Tolkien the man? And Marie is going to, we'll have time but for one or two about Tolkien the person. I'm no master of his biography, but I thought someone might have a question about what I've said. If you have none, that's okay. Is it warm in here, anybody but me? Oh, can't do that.
Could you comment on the effect of World War I on Tolkien?
Thank you. Did you all hear the question? The great mystery, in my view, of the friendship between Tolkien and Lewis is this. Lewis seemed to have been wholly unaffected by his experience in World War I. Though he was wounded by friendly fire, which means there's a very foul term that the Army uses when you miss the target and hit your own troops. It never appears in his fiction anywhere except the last battle, and that's not anything like what we get in The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was permanently marked by World War I. As I try to tell my students, World War I cuts the jugular of Western culture because these are the most civilized nations of the West. Germany, France, England, the Netherlands, Belgium, the US, in a massive bloodletting to no good end whatsoever. So Tolkien came to view war as the primary curse of the modern world. Think about what we now call our continuous war, what is now being called our eternal war. And Tolkien sees it all coming. He sees it in this book because it's in his blood. And at the end, if you remember when they go back for the scouring of the Shire, Sam says to Frodo, this is worse than Mordor. Frodo says, this is Mordor. Therefore, he orders the company to kill only those who were in open league with Saruman and his henchmen. And then he says, as for me, I will kill none. And when Tolkien had these passages pointed out to him, he was astonished that he was a quasi-pacifist when he thought of himself as a super nationalist. And he saw that the scourge of our age is war. As my Italian teacher said, va bene, it goes well, tutto finito. Oh, one question more?
Do you see one?
Yes, one right here.
What attracts you personally close to Tolkien?
Very good question. It came to me my very first year of teaching in 1971, long before anybody in this room was born. 1, 2, 3. This was the leftover of the 60s. I would have students who had marks on their arms where they'd shot up drugs. A student came to me one day and clarified it all with one sentence. He said, "When I read Tolkien, I feel clean." And clean is a double entendre. It means if you're drug-free, you're clean. But he meant morally, spiritually, religiously clean. There's no exaltation of the ugly, of the violent, for its own sake. Instead, it's wholeness, it is companionship, it is friendship, it is courage, and all the other 6 virtues that that book embodies. And I saw it for the first time when this student said that. I feel clean. Okay, let's go on then, if we could. Saint Pope John Paul II, of course, put his signature on what he called the culture of death. You all know this, but it's worth rereading. If you don't have your own personal copy of Evangelium Vitae, get one and reread it often. It's written in 1995. The 20th century will have been an era of massive attacks on life, an endless series of wars, and a continual taking of innocent human life. It doesn't take a brilliant brain to figure out what he's talking about. And how can we fail to consider the violence against life done to millions of human beings, especially children, who are forced into poverty, malnutrition, and hunger because of an unjust distribution of resources between peoples and between social classes. So don't ever accuse John Paul II of not having a social conscience. Do you know the one world celebrity who opposed the execution of Timothy McVeigh? John Paul II, who could see that to execute this man who killed how many, 170 in Oklahoma City with the bombing of the Murrah building, to kill him was to repeat what he had done. He called, therefore, for clemency for McVeigh. And what are the violence inherent not only in wars as such, but in this scandalous arms trade? And that's what, by the way, kept propelling World War I. The munition makers were making a killing off the manufacture and sale of arms, which spawns the many armed conflicts which stain our world with blood. What are the spreading of death caused by reckless tampering with the world's ecological balance? This is John Paul II. This is not Francis I. By the criminal spread of drugs. The opioid crisis, he sees it. Or by the promotion of certain kinds of sexual activity, which, besides being morally unacceptable, also involve grave risks to life. It's impossible to catalog completely the vast array of threats to human life. So many are the forms, whether explicit or hidden, in which they appear today. We're confronted by an even larger reality, which could be described as a veritable structure of sin. You see, he's not talking about individual, personal sins, but the larger fabric of sins that is devouring us. And that's what happens precisely in The Lord of the Rings. This reality is characterized by the emergence of a culture which denies solidarity, and in many cases takes the life form of a veritable, he invents the phrase right here, you're aware, a veritable culture of death. This culture is actively fostered by powerful cultural, economic, and political currents which encourage an idea of society excessively concerned with efficiency. Tolkien hated efficiency. He said anything worth doing well is worth doing slowly, gradually, not quickly. Looking at the situation from this point of view, it's possible to speak in a certain sense of a war of the powerful against the weak. a life which would require greater acceptance, love, care, is considered useless or held to be an intolerable burden and therefore is rejected one way or another. We warehouse our elderly. We kill them by putting them in nursing homes where the average American nursing home resident gets one visit per year. One. They rot. They develop dementia because they have no social world which keeps them alive. A person who, because of illness, handicap, or more simply, just by existing, Down syndrome child, for example, compromises the well-being or lifestyle of those who are more favored, tends to be looked upon as an enemy, to be resisted or eliminated. In this way, a kind of conspiracy against life is unleashed. This conspiracy involves not only individuals in their personal, family, or group relations, but note well, goes far beyond to the point of damaging and distorting at the international level relations between peoples and states. To be as honest as I can, Tolkien did not believe that all cultures are equal. Tolkien believed that there are cultures that are morally and superior and spiritually inferior and superior. He thought Egyptian culture was massively brutal. You can't say that today and get tenure on any American university. Remember the writers of Rohan, without whom the war against the ring would not have succeeded, are filled with bloodlust, unlike the true warriors of Aragorn. And there's a line in Tolkien that should make us shiver all the way down, where the narrators, and they sang as they slew. They sang as they slew. Killing was delightful, energy-giving. Tolkien sees it and says it. Therefore, this terrifying line, you all know it. The rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord in his dark throne in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the shadows bind them in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. Helen Free can tell you that the word Mordor is the Old English word for murder. So look what Tolkien's doing. He's picking up old words and giving them fresh meaning. Here is Mordor, such as Tolkien experienced. Tolkien came down with trench fever. Now we think that's something like the flu. It is not. It's a deadly disease. He almost died of it. He was so long recovering, he could not be sent back to the front because it was vermin-ridden, rats and parasites of all kinds. This is how they lived. Can you see the dead body? The corpse? See the guy's shoes right there? Not a living thing left. The whole land blasted, blighted. Have you seen pictures from Afghanistan that are just like that? You see them regularly now. They plant the sword, the rifle in the ground. They put the helmet on top of it. I have a friend in Afghanistan, and my fear will end up like this. Look at the solemnity of Tolkien's face in his World War I uniform. He's not smiling as if to say, let me go out and get some action. Let me put bullets in the belly of the Krauts. No. So, my argument is much briefer than my preface. is that Tolkien believes that one of the curatives for the horrors of our world is the disappearance of a sense of wonder. Now notice well, I think John Free has designed this series with this in mind. You don't have to be a Christian to have a sense of wonder. So look at the way in which Plato defined wonder. In his Theaetetus, he says Socrates presents the young Theaetetus with a number of difficult contradictions. This is the exchange that ensues. Socrates, I believe that you follow me, Theaetetus, for I suspect that you have thought of these questions before now. Yes, Socrates, and I'm amazed when I think of them. By the gods I am, and I want to know what on earth they mean. And there are times when my head quite swims with the contemplation of them. I see, my dear Theaetetus, that Theodorus has a true insight into your nature when he said that you were a philosopher. I hope we have philosophers. I see some priests in the room, maybe philosophers. For wonder is the feeling of a philosopher, and philosophy begins in wonder. Now repeat that. Wonder is the feeling of a philosopher, and philosophy begins in wonder. He was not a bad genealogist who said that Iris, the messenger of heaven, is the child of Thaumas, wonder. And of course, the basic question is, that prompts inexhaustible wonder is, why is there something and not nothing? Why am I, and you? I remember when I was, I can't remember, young child, I asked myself, but who made God? Where did God come from? Of course, I was asking just this question. God doesn't come from anywhere. Who made you? God made you. Who is God? God is a spirit infinitely perfect. What did he make you for? To know, love, and enjoy him forever. Does anyone recognize what I'm repeating? The Baltimore Catechism. In the Metaphysics, Aristotle says that it's wonder that led to the first philosophers to philosophy. Since a man who is puzzled thinks of himself as ignorant and philosophizes to escape from his ignorance. In his commentary on the Metaphysics, Aquinas seems to agree, adding that because philosophy arises from awe, another word for wonder, a philosopher is bound in his way to be a lover, note, of myths and poetic fables. Anyone see how we're moving toward Tolkien? That's what Tolkien is obsessed with. Poets and philosophers are alike in being big with wonder. And big is there meaning something very close to pregnancy. If Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas are correct in attributing philosophy, and by extension science, religion, art, and all else that transcends everyday existence, to wonder, then it becomes important to ask, what exactly is wonder? We usually think of wonder as something that astonishes, that surprises, that throws us back on our heels, that makes us stop yammering and to look with trance-like attention. Chesterton says that's not the truest sense of wonder. I sent to my friend John Free a passage from Chesterton, who finds wonder in an ordinary wooden fence post, making the point, there's no reason that fence post has to exist. It's simply there. And anything that's simply there is worthy of our attention. And so he said, I conclude, if you will accept my argument, that the post and my head are both made of wood. I've taught Hopkins this very week. Hopkins says, I see our Lord in a bluebell. You have bluebells in Nebraska, I assume. Tiny little flower, the size of your little finger. You see his point? Every bluebell is unique. No, he was not afraid of Darwin at all. Hopkins wasn't. Every bluebell is unique, none a mere repetition. Now, they do belong to classes, genus, species, and the like, but Hopkins is obsessed with what he calls the haikietas of things, the thisness of things, the things that are this way and not some other way, and therefore Christ is the unique God-man, and so a bluebell becomes a sign of the ultimate wonder of Christ himself. Now, Tolkien puts his own kind of slant on this by seizing upon the Greek word poesis, which is a word that means making. And the Scots get it even better. The Scots word for poet is makar, M-A-K-A-R, one who is a maker. Because Tolkien believes that everyone in this room is a poet, a maker. We spend our lives making all the time. I love the phrase we say of you ladies, you make up your face. Some of you wish that I could make up mine. The clothes we choose are acts of making. The carpet, the wood, this stand are all acts of making. And so everybody is making all the time, but in this modified sense, not as God makes. God makes ex nihilo, out of nothing, because if God makes out of something prior, then there is more than God, something outside God. So God, in the act of sheer miraculous wonder, makes the cosmos out of nothing. We then refashion all the things that God has made all of the time. And that means the magnificent machines we have. Look at the lighting in this room. When I show slides in my classes, I'm just astonished that I can show great classic works of art that I would never have had a chance to see when I was a college student. Those are all wonders of making. And for Tolkien, speech and story, as I've said before, are the uniquely human acts. Though he believes also that complex tools and drawing are really close behind. He also believes, as I've just said, that empires and nations are acts of making. Look at what Korea is making right now. I learned this only yesterday. I didn't get the news, but a mom that could reach San Francisco. But above all, of course, it implies also to us in this radically, divinely free cosmos. Everything, therefore, is becoming more wondrous, beautiful, or else uglier. And of course, the ultimate act of subcreation is making our own lives either more wondrous or more hideous. So he wrote this poem to his friend C.S. Lewis. Lewis had spent his life studying the great myths of the world, and said, I love those great myths of dying and rising gods, of virgins giving birth without having concourse with males. They're beautiful lies breathed through silver. What a marvelous metaphor. Lies breathed through silver. In other words, they're just made up by sheer human ingenuity. I would love to believe that they're pointing to something real, but I know he's read his Freud, he's read his Marx. They're simply massive human self-deceptions. They are projections of what human beings would want there to be outside themselves. So Tolkien and Lewis have a long midnight until 2:30 a.m. walk in the Deer Park of Magdalen College, where Lewis taught, in which Tolkien said, now Lewis, wait just a minute. Why would all of these cultures have this similar set of myths unless something were driving them toward such imaginative acts? And why, if that is the case, might in at least one instance it come true? Where God is not only the ultimate myth maker, but God is the ultimate actor. in the myth that he makes. And so he writes this poem. Notice the wonderful, witty title. It's called Mythopoeia, which means the making of myths. And it's written from Philomythus, the one who loves myth, to Misomythus, the one who hates myth, Lewis. This is the essence of Tolkien. It's a much longer poem, but see if you can get it. I think the kids in the front row can get it. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. His world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact, the thing God made, the cosmos. Don't worship that, because man, the sub-creator, everyone in this room is a sub-creator, is the refracted light through whom is splintered from a single white to many colors, hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we fill with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods in their houses out of dark and light, and sow the seeds of dragons, 'twas our right. But notice, used or misused, that right is not decayed. We make still by the law in which we were made. We make still by the law in which we are made. There are many evil myths. The Aryan myths of the Germanic world were evil. But if you have this theology, that God has given us this magnificent power of reshaping the world into new forms, then you have a means of judging what's evil about the Aryan myths. I grew up in a place whose myth was that black people are natively inferior to me, that they descended from apes, and therefore they were not allowed to drink from the same water fountains I drank from, to use the same restrooms, to eat in the same cafes, to stay in the motels where I stayed, and God forbid to attend my church. An evil myth created by my own sick, poison culture. Tolkien helps us overthrow those myths by showing us what true myth is. So, let's talk about the terror that Tolkien is trying to combat. War, first of all. Can you see from these quotations Tolkien's first-hand experience? I can't see who it was who asked the question, but can you see it? Tolkien is writing out of his own experience. I have a very dear friend who was a decorated Marine in Vietnam. He says there is no other word to describe what we did in Vietnam than genocide. We shot everything that moved, lest they be in alliance with the Viet Cong. That's what Tolkien's talking about. Aragorn, this is at the final assault of the Black Gates of Mordor, looked at them, and there was pity in his eyes rather than wrath. For these were young men from Rohan, from Westfold, far away, or husbandmen, farmers from Losarnock. And to them Mordor had been from childhood a name of evil, Korea. And yet unreal, a legend that had no part in their simple life. And now they walk like men in a hideous dream made true. And they understood not this war, nor why fate should lead them to such a pass. And so they began to flee. And remember, in the classical pre-Christian world, the ultimate act of cowardice is to betray your company, betray your leader. In fact, if you betray your leader, you're shot, you're killed as a coward. Look what makes this book so deeply Christian. When Aragorn says to them, Go, but keep what honor you may. Do not run. It's beneath your dignity. And there is a task which you may attempt, and so be not wholly shamed. Take your way southwest till you come to Cair Andros. And if that is still held by the enemies, as I think, then retake it, if you can, and hold it to the last in defense of Gondor and Rohan. And that, of course, is book 5 of the last volume. For Tolkien, the ultimate wonder is the gift of being put on a quest. And Tolkien makes a very sharp distinction between a quest and an adventure. I would wager someone on the front row can tell me the subtitle of The Hobbit. Anyone? Subtitle of The Hobbit, yes, sir? There and back again. Because an adventure is what we call it later, striking out for the left coast. You're bored, you'll play the slots, make a little money, lose a little money, visit the decadence of Los Angeles, come back, and resume your life. Now, it's not that bad in the Hobbit, but Bilbo's bored when the elves come by and say, dwarves come by and say, help us rescue this gold stolen by Smaug. He said, yeah, life in Hobbiton is boring. I'll go. But he comes right back where he started. He volunteers to go on a quest, on an adventure. Notice how differently a quest shapes up. You don't volunteer for a quest. You have to be called, summoned to a quest. Our Lord says in John 15, you did not call me, I called you. So listen to Frodo. This couldn't be more like the Gospel of John. Because you're seeking some ultimate good, not having a good time, not entertainment. And that entails a calling, a summons, a mission. But note well, with no promise of success. There is cancer ramping in the guts of probably several people in this room. Maybe mine. And we're going to die miserable deaths, more than likely. That doesn't matter if you've been called to the right kind of quest. And so Frodo says, I'm not made for perilous quest. I wish I'd never seen the ring. Why did it come to me? Why was I, look at the word, chosen. Why was I chosen? You did not choose me, I chose you, says Christ. Listen to Gandalf's answer. Such questions cannot be answered. You may be sure it was not for any merit that others do not possess. You're not a member of Mensa. You're not the handsomest hobbit in the Shire. You're not the most muscular or the most athletic. Now, he's been given a good upbringing by Bilbo. It's not because he's some Greek hero. You're not chosen for power or wisdom at any rate. But you have been chosen. And you must therefore use such strength and wits as you have. And wits here means, of course, intelligence. The opposite of being called to a quest is to take shortcuts by means of what Tolkien calls sorcery, magic. Be sure to note there is no magic anywhere in the company of the 9 walkers. Gandalf is not a magician. He is able to set off those marvelous fireworks because he's mastered the craft of fire. Magic is an attempt to crunch nature, to make it respond on your schedule quickly. Therefore, Tolkien calls it by its right name, sorcery. And Isengard, of course, is the fortress of Saruman. Sounds just like some places I've been, not in Nebraska, thank God, but places you've been as well. It resembles a graveyard of unquiet dead. What a phrase. For the ground trembled, the shafts ran down by many slopes and spiral stairs to caverns far under. There Saruman had treasuries, storehouses, armories, smithies, and great furnaces. Listen to this, iron wheels revolve there endlessly, and hammers thudded at night. Plumes of vapor steamed from the vents, lit from beneath with red light, blue or venomous green. Sauron, therefore, is a sorcerer in precisely this mechanical fashion. He uses his craftsmanship for the sake of power over others. He fashions the one ring in order to put all the other rings under his denomination. And therefore, he's called the necromancer. Necro is the Greek Latin root for black, not Negro, necro. He practices the black arts. Just as Angmar, king of the ring race, is rightly called sorcerer. Because of his cunning, he grew ever higher in the Lord Sauron's favor. And he learned great sorcery and knew much of the mind of Sauron. He was more cruel than any orc. So very briefly, and I'll come to my end. The ring conveys three powers. If you possess the ring, you will not die. You go on living and living and living and living and living. Ever greater longevity, but without a corresponding height and depth. Notice how hard it is for Bilbo to give up the ring. He said, I felt like too little butter spread over too much bread. Isn't that a wonderful homely image? Too little butter spread over too much bread. Because he's had the ring long enough to make him see he could stay alive as long as he had the ring. A medieval city was centered around a cathedral. A modern city is centered around either a huge economic complex, a huge sports complex, or a huge medical complex. When I brought my friend Stanley Hauerwas to Wake Forest, which is centered around a huge medical complex, he looked up and said, behold the house that death has built. Evelyn Waugh says nobody wants that extra decade that modern medicine has given us. We're going to lie there in the bed with a diaper between our legs, not knowing that we exist. And then he said, well, I'll never forget, he said, if you ask the average American, which means everybody in this room, and most especially the speaker, and it catches us off guard so we don't prepare to give the right answer. What is the purpose of life? The average American will say, the purpose of life is not to die. And friends, that's funny. I mean, that's absurd. Not to die, but to stay alive as long as possible, the better to have a good time. Death haunts us. Remember when we celebrate our saints' days? Not their birthdays, their death days. The elves come to envy us mortals because they don't have the privilege of dying. That they can be killed in battle or they can grieve themselves to death, but they don't die naturally. And so Sauron sees, look, if I could give people this gift of unending life, I would have them trapped. Our culture is trapped. The second gift is the gift of invisibility. If you have the ring and wear the ring, you cannot be seen. One reason I like Baylor, and I'm sure it's just like the Newman Institute here at Lincoln, good students, and I'm glad to see several of them. So I asked my students, what would be the modern equivalent of the gift of invisibility? If you put the ring on, you cannot be seen. And the student raised his hand and said, the internet. She is dead on. We are invisible on the internet. You can say anything under the sun and get by with it. Make any claim, no matter how horrible, fake news and all the rest, because we are, in effect, invisible. I remember giving this lecture at Oberlin, similar one, and a friend said, "Do you know the story in Plato's Republic? The story between Glaucon, the debate between Glaucon and Socrates. Socrates is, of course, making the classic Greek argument that if you show a person the good, the person will do the good without any kind of reward or bribe. Good is so naturally, inherently attractive, we'll do it. And Glaucon is a much closer Christian than Socrates. Said, wait a minute. I knew a man named Gyges, Gyges, who had this magical ring, and when he wore it, he was invisible, and therefore he could steal without being caught. He could rob without being caught. He could rape without being caught. He could kill without being caught. So what does he do? He, of course, kills the king invisibly and becomes the king who takes as his wife the queen. Tolkien sees that ours is a world in which we're becoming ghosts. Do any of you know C.S. Lewis's great little short novel called The Great Divorce? Get thee to the bookstore quickly. If you don't, it's about people who are becoming ghosts. We are gossamer. We are thin. We're like the ring wraiths. Where the ring wraiths look like bodies, but no bodies there. They're invisible. The third quality, of course, is the worst of all, coercion. If you have the ring, you can coerce other people's wills. You can make them do what you want them to do. Even the noblest of all hobbits, Frodo, fails in the end. I've seen the manuscript at Marquette University where for the unbelievable price of $10,000, Marquette bought the whole manuscript to The Lord of the Rings. And there in Tolkien's own beautiful little scrawl, he has Frodo change the wording at the end. Frodo, in the original, had said, I will not do what I came to do, the ring is mine. In the revised manuscript, which just becomes the printed word, Frodo says, I do not choose to do what I came to do, the ring is mine. So Tolkien is making the point that Frodo's will has given over itself, despite all of his magnificent resistance, to Sauron's will, and fails, therefore, in the end. And that becomes part of Tolkien's larger vision. We're talking about this at the dinner table, where Tolkien is fully ready to acknowledge that as soon as Sauron is killed, and he is at the end, because, as you know, Gollum bites the ring off his finger and does that dancing jig and topples backward into the pit. The ring is destroyed. Tolkien says a new Sauron will soon arise. There is no final defeat of evil in this world. Now, when I tell my 18 years old that, they don't say that, sir. Here's Tolkien's phrase: we fight the long defeat. We fight the long defeat. We are not going to win. We're going to lose. The question is how we lose, and for what purposes we lose, what instruments of resistance we will use in losing. Will we use the instruments of ISIS? Will we use the instruments of North Korea? If we do, of course, we will have won in a way that's worse than losing. So for Tolkien, the ultimate wonder is that evil will win in this world. Evil, however, will finally destroy itself, because evil, remember, from Augustine forward, who borrows this from Philo of Alexandria, from the Neoplatonist, whose name I forget, called evil privatio boni, the absence, privation, twisting of the good. And as such, evil has no being, no real existence. So eventually ISIS will kill itself. But look what damage ISIS, look what damage abortion, look what damage, shall I go on, is happening in our world. And our call is to resist that by the small company of 9 walkers. And the vision that finally Sam has. Sam's my favorite character. Aren't you glad I didn't say all this? So let me leave you with this passage. Frodo is a very light sleeper. He usually doesn't fall asleep completely. And Sam has to guard over him. But this one time, Sam really falls soundly to sleep. Frodo falls soundly to sleep, and Sam comes out from under their little cover in the midst of Mordor. And remember, Mordor is so totally polluted, the sun can barely get through it all. And at night, if you see one star, you're lucky. Sam sees that one star. There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor. Tor means a sharp mountain peak. Oh my. What did I do? Oh, golly, what did I do? Race through it? I can't go backwards, can I? Because I really wanted you to hear this. I'm sorry. Your dry device. Anyhow, what Sam is, if Marie can fix it, okay. If not, okay. You got it? Wonderful. That's enough. That's enough. Don't worry about it being any larger. Thank you, ma'am. There, peeping high among the cloud rack, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. Notice the beauty, we would add the wonder of it, smote. Tolkien loves old, strong English verbs. Smite, smote, spitten. Smote his heart as he looked up out of that forsaken land of Mordor. And notice hope returned to him. For like a shaft clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond the reach of the shadow. Now for a moment, his own fate, even his master's fate, ceased to trouble him. He crawled back into the brambles and laid himself by Frodo's side, putting away all fear, casting away all fear. He cast himself into a deep and untroubled sleep. You see what Tolkien is saying there? We're going to lose this world, but there are things that transcend this world. And therein lies our hope. And that is, light defines the darkness, not the other way around. Truth defines deceit and lies, not the other way around. Beauty defines ugliness, not the other way around. Good defines evil, not the other way around. So truth, goodness, beauty will never die. And Tolkien, writing this pre-Christian book, is unable to say, because God, the uncreated light, has shown himself in the Christ of the Incarnation. That would be preaching, what his friend Lewis might do. But can you see what Tolkien is here suggesting? This is a hope for which every person in this room can live and for which we will all be glad to die. Thank you very much.